Logan?
Yes. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to this fourth week of the Political Science 216 Zoom webinar on the 2020 presidential election. For those of you who are new to joining us, and we've had a number of late ads and some new additions to the public link. My name is Joel Cassiola, and I am a member of the Political Science Department, and I am thrilled and excited to invite you to this wonderful panel on the topic of the environment and the 2020 presidential election. Before we get to the panel and my introductions of the faculty, I just want to make a brief word about the quiz for this course. As I mentioned at our first meeting, in order to earn credit for this course, you will need to earn an average of 70 or higher on 3 quizzes. And I would like the first quiz to refer to the first 4 weeks of the weekly sessions, beginning on August 25th. And then we talked about the Electoral College. And then on September 1st, the pandemic. And then on September 8th, the economy, and now on the environment. So if you are new to the class, please make every effort to watch the recordings on these 4 weeks. When I compose the quiz, I will send an email out to all of the enrolled students with the open access time for the quiz. And I will give you ample time so that you can not only return to the videos or see them for the first time, but you can go back and watch them again in preparation for the quiz. So I suspect the quiz will be in about 2 weeks, and you will have a week or so to complete the quiz. If there are any concerns out there among the enrolled students about the quiz, please don't hesitate to email me. And I will give you updated information next week on the first quiz. Okay, with that, the panel has chosen a video to help everyone out there understand the complex and vital, urgent issue of climate change. So we will look at the video for about 12 minutes, and then we will have the panel's presentations. Professor McAfee, if you can hit the button.
Mm-hmm. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Let me just clear up the screen so you can see it better. Okay.
1,000 years, the average global temperature didn't change by more than 1 degree Celsius. But then humans started burning fossil fuels around here. Today, global temperatures have risen about 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. This is what that looks like so far. Storms have gotten more intense. Wildfires are more common, and ancient glaciers are melting faster and faster. And that's just 1 degree of warming. Without global action, the world is on track to warm at least 3 degrees Celsius by 2100. This would be catastrophic. That's why most scientists agree that we need to limit global warming to this range, between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Carbon dioxide, which is emitted when we burn fossil fuels, accounts for most of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. It's the main culprit behind climate change. And to limit global warming to the degree that scientists are calling for, we have to stop releasing it. We have to decarbonize. The US doesn't currently emit the most carbon dioxide of any country, but as one of the oldest industrial powers, it's emitted more carbon dioxide in total than any other country or region. So America has a big role to play in decarbonizing. But how is the US supposed to do that? And is it actually possible?
If you want to get halfway there by 2030, you have to start now, going fast. There is literally zero more time to waste.
Dave writes about energy and climate for Vox, and he says the 2020 US election comes with fairly clear stakes.
If Trump is reelected, that's it. Like, there's no chance for 1.5, and probably all chances for 2 degrees are gone.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, open up the coal mines, new offshore oil and gas leasing program.
President Trump doesn't have a climate policy, and his re-election will most likely continue policies designed to boost the fossil fuel industry. They'd increase carbon emissions instead of decreasing them, and the effects would be felt globally.
You just can't have the world's second biggest economy opting out, moving the opposite direction, and expect the world to get there.
The other major candidate in the election does have a plan to address climate change, and this part in particular is ambitious.
In 2050, the United States will be 100% clean energy economy.
Biden has been convinced and pushed to the point that he's got a great climate plan.
What Biden's plan doesn't get into are the details on how exactly the US would actually do that. But there are people who have thought about what it might look like to decarbonize by 2050. And to understand that, it helps to get a picture of where America's energy comes from and where it goes.
Sorry, my son nearly stepped on a snake. Do you want to say hi?
This is Saul Griffith. He's a physicist and an engineer, but this is how Dave describes him.
Probably the person who knows more about energy as it's used in the United States than any other human being.
A few years ago, Saul decided to make a model of America's energy use. He ended up reading basically every available piece of data from
The Energy Information Administration, Department of Transportation, National Highway Transit Authority, the Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and NOAA. And so we pull all of those together to build a very comprehensive picture of the US energy economy.
That picture of the US energy economy, it looks like this.
If you're just looking at the whole thing at once, it just looks like a big pile of spaghetti. It's hard to make sense of, but it just traces energy, every unit of energy. How does it enter the economy? How is it used throughout the economy?
This kind of chart is called a Sankey Diagram, and it's easier to understand in 3 sections. These columns here on the left are the sources of all the energy used in the US, like natural gas, coal, solar, wind, nuclear, and oil. This column in the middle is what those energy sources get converted into. So a lot of it becomes electricity. Most oil becomes the fuel we use for transportation. And here you can see how much natural gas energy is being used to generate electricity versus being used directly to power things like cooking stoves. And over here on the right, this is where all the energy is used, broken down into incredible detail, like how much energy is being used to light shopping malls in the US, or how much energy is being used by vehicles driven for work.
So you start to get this incredibly detailed picture of all of the interconnections, which is really, really important when you do the next exercise. But what happens if we decarbonize?
Remember that carbon emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels, this stuff. And Paul says that means that to decarbonize, we just need to follow their path. The first place that leads you is here, with electricity and the energy we use to generate it, the majority of which in the US comes from 2 kinds of fossil fuel, natural gas and coal. If the US wants to decarbonize, it needs to stop getting electricity this way and to replace it with other decarbonized energy sources. That means coal power plants, gone. Gas power plants, gone. All electricity would come from renewable sources: wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric and biomass, or nuclear energy. Decarbonizing the way we get electricity would be a huge investment, but it would also only eliminate 20% of emissions. And that's because electricity and energy are not exactly the same thing.
That doesn't solve the vehicle's emissions. It doesn't solve your heating emissions from using natural gas or fuel oil in your basement.
All these other parts of the economy draw their energy directly from fossil fuels. Like transportation, we use oil for fuel, and commercial and residential buildings where we use gas and oil for heat. But Saul says there's a kind of elegant solution to this. You decarbonize these sectors by switching their energy source from here to here. Make all of it electric. Because we already have almost all the technology we need to do it.
Heat pumps, batteries, electric vehicles, wind turbines, nuclear power plants, yes, we know that can work. We know we can do electric cars. We know we can do electric heat for nearly everything.
It's all, in the end, just about machines, right? We got a bunch of machines that use fossil fuel energy. We need to replace them with machines that use clean electricity. And so it really just comes down to a matter of industrial capacity. How fast can you build machines?
There are some things we'd have a harder time decarbonizing. Air travel will rely on fossil fuels until alternative technologies get better. And things like steel and concrete are really hard to manufacture without fossil fuels. But if we decarbonized as much as possible with the technology that we have now, it would end most of the US's carbon emissions. This chart shows the country's carbon emissions broken down by economic sector. If electricity, residential, commercial, and transportation were mostly decarbonized, you'd have solved a lot of the problem. All of this would be a huge undertaking, and it needs to happen fast. Saul's research modeled different scenarios for the transition from fossil fuel-based machines to electric ones, from a market-driven transition to carbon taxes, to a much more direct and heavy-handed approach that would replace our machines with their electric counterparts very quickly. And he found that because we've delayed action for so long, none of these slower approaches will be enough.
If you went back to 2000 and started then, you could just put like a modest carbon tax in place, and it would have just eased us down over the course of 30 years or whatever. But emissions kept rising and rising and rising. So now to get where we need to go, they gotta fall off a cliff, and that means zero delay. We're just talking about a level of industrial mobilization that none of us alive have seen. It would look like what FDR did to prepare the US for war. Literally every single solitary fossil fuel machine that goes out of service is replaced by a clean energy alternative. Every furnace, car, factory, name it.
Nearly everyone is buying an electric vehicle. Nearly everyone is buying rooftop solar. Nearly every new power plant that comes online is industrial scale solar or industrial wind. We need that level of effort to do a lot better than 2 degrees.
All of recorded human history has happened within an era of relative climate stability, an era that's about to end. But we still have control over what comes next. And the global effort that'll require hinges in part on what the US decides to do. America can decarbonize. We have the technology to do it. We have the resources. The only question is whether we want to do it.
I have a 6-year-old and 11-year-old, and I have to believe that's going to happen. Otherwise, I have to try to make that happen as long as possible, because it's their future we're stealing by not doing it.
Thanks for watching this episode of our 2020 election series. We're focusing on the issues that matter most to you, and we got this topic requested by a lot of people. Zach said the candidates should be talking about the steps we need to take to drastically reduce our carbon footprint and our impact on the environment. Jade asked what policies will be implemented during their terms to stop America from being the second largest carbon producer. And Oliver asked, how do they plan to reduce carbon emissions to zero and on what timeline? We want to know what you think the candidates should be talking about. Tell us at vox.com/election videos.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor McAfee, for that really informative video.
In the year of the unthinkable. So Wells Fargo was using some of our locations as drive-up food banks to help provide 50 million.
All right.
The unthinkable has happened.
I'll wait.
Time to rethink how to make a difference.
Sorry.
Wells Fargo.
Okay. We got that plug-in for the local bank.
No, sorry.
This
I
might
have
just
to,
seem like an ordinary view of the ocean.
okay. I think I've got it now.
Great.
Sorry.
And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers this afternoon. And I'm really excited about this panel, not only because I have spent almost my whole career studying the environment as a political theorist, but also I think, as you will see, the members of this panel are truly distinguished, not only in their scholarship, in their teaching, but also in their activities outside of the classroom. I have been most impressed with how they apply their knowledge to help the world respond to the various environmental challenges. Our first speaker is Professor Glenn Fieldman from Environmental Studies. Professor Fieldman is a professor and director of environmental studies, and she earned a PhD in international studies in 1990 from the Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, where she was a Corbel Fellow. Her dissertation was a comparative study of the French and Russian revolutions with an emphasis on political economy. Her recent research is in environmental political economy. This past March, she had an article published entitled Finance Unchained, the Political Economy of Unsustainability. And it was published in the journal Sustainability. She explains how the current international system of monetary and financial relations contributes to environmental problems. She's a member of the coordinating committee of the nonprofit organization Fossil Free California, whose goal is to force California's 2 large state pension funds to divest from fossil fuels. And she's also a member of the Open Space and Ecology Committee of the city of Brisbane, whose remit includes recommending climate and other environmental policies to Brisbane's City Council. Professor Fieldman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joel. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to get right to it and share my screen here. What I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to try to give you a little bit more detail about President Trump's environmental record. The film, the video sketched over it very briefly, and I'd like to preface that by simply saying that we might call Trump the anti-environmental president. I don't think that's really an exaggeration. His policies have been a departure from 50 years of environmental policy made by Congress and carried out by presidents. And we've really seen a departure with this president, who has now compiled a 4-year record that we can look at. And I am going to talk a little bit about his climate change relevant policies, and I want to underline a point that was made in the video, but I think bears repeating, which is that carbon dioxide as a gas stays in the atmosphere for over 100 years. So it's piling up there, it's accumulating. And every day that we don't do something about it, we release a lot more of it, and it's going to stay up there in the atmosphere trapping heat for 100 years or more. And that's why it's so urgent that, as Dave Roberts said in the film, we have to get moving right away. We have lost a lot of precious time. And in fact, the Trump administration has really sent us into reverse in many ways. We've seen many setbacks to the cautious policies that were put in place by previous administrations, particularly President Obama's, to reduce emissions. When, by contrast, we need to be reducing them at about 7.6% per year. The Trump administration's policies are actually increasing them. I want to talk just very briefly about 3 of the things that he's done. These are examples and not a comprehensive list. So one of the important things that he has done that has increased our emissions and will be increasing global warming is that he's repealed what is called the Methane Rule. This, like his other environmental deregulations and reversals, is really a favor to corporate America, specifically the fossil fuel industry. Methane is natural gas. That's really what natural gas is methane. And when it's unburned, it traps way more heat per molecule than carbon dioxide does. And so one of the very first things we should do is try to reduce methane emissions as much as possible. President Obama ordered fossil fuel companies to take measures to keep methane from leaking. And President Trump has just reversed that order. He said, don't worry about it, go ahead. And so a major source of greenhouse emissions is now going to be unchecked. Fossil fuel companies also flare methane that they don't want to use, which is what's in the photograph here. And when it's flared, methane, like other fossil fuels, emits carbon dioxide. So President Trump has actually encouraged those wasteful practices. Another thing that President Obama did, which was very significant, is that he tried to put the brakes on carbon emissions from transportation. And that's really significant because transportation is now the biggest source of carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. And in California, it's even bigger. In California, transportation is responsible for almost 40% of our total emissions. What President Obama did was increase fuel mileage standards. And another way to understand that is to say that he decreased the amount of carbon dioxide that cars would emit per mile. President Trump, again, with a move that he thought was business friendly, relaxed those limits. And so automakers are no longer being challenged to ramp up fuel efficiency as much as possible, which is a shame because burning a single gallon of gasoline in an internal combustion engine produces almost 20 pounds of carbon dioxide, something to think about when you turn on the ignition in your car next time. The video did mention that President Trump has been very friendly to fossil fuel extraction, and so he has basically said that US public lands are open for business and has encouraged the opening of areas such as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for fossil fuel extraction, which is a highly risky enterprise, not only for the climate, but also for the other environmental effects that even normal operations, let alone an accident, might have on this fragile region. I want to shift gears now and talk about some of the other things, the other areas of environmental policy that President Trump has reversed effectively while he's been in office. One of them, it's very important, and I decided to make a slide on it just because I don't think it's gotten the attention it deserves. President Trump has made clear that scientific expertise that sends unwelcome messages like humans are changing the climate and it's bad news. President Trump has done his best to muzzle scientists, to prevent them from saying those kinds of things because they go against his policy direction. And indeed, many scientists have been forced out of agencies such as the EPA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Just last week, the president appointed a climate change denier to a top position in that agency. And so we've really seen a lot of undermining of the scientific expertise that these agencies need to make correct policies. The president has weakened the Endangered Species Act, which is one of the core environmental laws and one that was admired all over the world. And he has done that by weakening habitat protections for endangered species, such as the one pictured in the background here. This is a Florida panther, beautiful animal. Probably fewer than 3 dozen individuals are left. The main cause, the main reason that they're in so much trouble is that their habitat has either disappeared or it's been fragmented by things like highways going through their territories. And so weakening habitat protections is very bad news for many species that are holding on by their fingernails already. The president has also ordered the weakening of many regulations protecting air quality and water quality. And one thing that's important to remember, I think, about all of this is that when these laws and rules are weakened, whether they're about climate change or toxic pollutants in the air, they are doing damage to people. This woman is fishing. This photograph was taken in Louisiana. You can see in the background here, this big chemical plant, giving to this area the name Cancer Alley. People in this region breathe toxic air and are adjacent to toxic water every day of their lives. It's really affecting their life expectancy and their quality of life. A couple more slides to go. What about the Democrats? As I've mentioned before, neither party has done enough on climate policy. That's why we're in a bad position right now. Part of the reason for that is that the fossil fuel industry gives money to and exercises influence over both major parties. So it's really important when you vote to look carefully at particular candidates' voting records and statements to try to get clear on what their position really is. I will say, and I think Professor McAfee is going to say more about this, activism from groups like the Sunrise Movement, which organized a sit-in at the Washington, D.C. office of the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is having an effect. And we've seen that presidential nominee Joe Biden's proposed climate policy plan has improved a lot since he first announced his candidacy. Final thing I want to say is that Congress really matters. I've talked about executive power because that's where the policy action is right now. But in the future, we will need to look to Congress to strengthen existing laws and to pass new ones. We don't really have a federal climate law, and we need one. It's only Congress that can appropriate the money to make the big investments that were discussed in the video. Congress can also do things to impose checks on power-hungry executives and to reduce the influence of money in politics. So your vote for Congress matters as much as your vote for president. Last slide, former President Obama recently said, vote as if your life depended on it. He's right. The things that we're doing to the earth, our home, our life support system, many of them are irreversible, and they threaten the abundance that has supported human life and human civilization for the last 10,000 years. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, and thank you for those slides, Professor Fieldman. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Melissa K. Nelson, who is Anishinaabe Metis, Turtle Mountain Chippewa, and she is an ecologist, writer, editor, media maker, and indigenous scholar activist. Her work is dedicated to indigenous rights and sustainability, biocultural heritage and environmental justice, intercultural solidarity, and the renewal and celebration of community health and cultural arts. She actively advocates for indigenous people's rights and sustainable lifeways in higher education, nonprofits, and philanthropy, and is particularly passionate about indigenous food sovereignty at local, regional, and global levels. Melissa served as a professor of American Indian Studies at San Francisco State University from 2002 to 2020. She is now professor of Indigenous Sustainability at Arizona State University and continues to work with the Cultural Conservancy, which she has led since 1993. She received her PhD from the University of California at Davis in the field of ecology. She is also the editor and contributor to Original Instructions, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future, and a co-editor of Traditional Ecological Knowledge, Learning from the Indigenous Practices for Environmental Sustainability. Melissa is also the writer and host of the Native Seed Pod, a podcast dedicated to indigenous science and native foods. Melissa serves on the boards of directors of the Segoria Tea Land Trust, the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, and Slow Food Indigenous Terra Madre. I just want to express my personal thanks to Melissa, who is no longer a member of San Francisco State's faculty, for her to contribute to this Zoom webinar is beyond the call of duty. So I really appreciate Melissa contributing, even though she is now an official member of Arizona State University. Melissa.
Thank you so much, Joel, and thank you to my wonderful co-panelists. It's an honor to serve with you. I admire and respect all of your work so much, and I will continue to be a part of the SF State community in different ways. I first want to acknowledge the First Peoples on whose land SF State stands on, the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples and all the Ohlone peoples of the San Francisco Bay Area. Also the coastal Miwok people and Southern Pomo, represented by the sovereign nation, the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria in Marin and Sonoma counties, where the Romberg-Tiburon campus lies as part of our extended SFSU campuses. I thank the First Peoples of this land, past, present, future generations, for taking good care of this place we call the San Francisco Bay Area for thousands of years. Today I want to talk to you about Indigenous peoples' environmental knowledge and climate change as we enter this post-industrial pre-collapse, a phrase coined by the great poet Gary Snyder probably 30 years ago, when he was looking to the future at what was coming down the path here as we find ourselves now in 2020, facing horrific fires, horrific superstorms, global warming of extreme proportions, droughts and flooding in different regions, and an election that is probably the most significant decision we will make in terms of the fate and future of the lands of the United States of America. So again, thank you to my fellow panelists, and I'm excited to share a little bit more about Indigenous peoples' role as environmental stewards and guardians and as climate justice activists. Just for a little background for folks who maybe don't know, there are globally approximately 350 million people who identify as indigenous peoples all around the world. Here in the United States, there are 574 federally recognized tribes, sovereign nations, who have their own lands and governance and languages and cultures and lifeways. The population is very conservatively estimated to be about 5 million people who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native in the United States. That does not include a lot of Native people who do not fit within those criteria, do not belong to federally recognized tribes like many of the Native peoples of California. Combined tribal lands, official federally recognized lands in the United States comprises about 100 million acres. If they were all combined, that would be the 4th largest state in the United States. So it's a very significant land mass, and yet it is a fraction of the original tribal territories that those Indian nations obviously managed. Contained within these reservation land bases are some of the last refugia of biodiversity, endangered species, endemic species, and really represents extraordinary biodiversity that needs to be protected and revitalized, restored. Sadly, these reservations are also targeted by the US government, by industries. Tribal laws, sovereignty can be manipulated so that mining and other types of extractive activities can take place there, where they waive environmental and cultural protection laws. So that is why so many tribes have some of the highest rates of cancer. They're cancer alleys because of toxic waste, coal mining, uranium mining that happens on or adjacent to native lands such as the Navajo Nation. So a concept very important in this work is combining biological diversity. We know the richness of native plants and animals and ecosystems from genetics to landscapes, but equally important is cultural diversity and the knowledge, the languages, the wisdom of all of the different cultures on this planet that make up so much of the lifeways and the worldviews of indigenous peoples and all diverse peoples. So biocultural diversity is a really important concept and phrase that we use in indigenous studies and now conservation. And according to Louisa Maffei, a colleague and co-founder of the nonprofit Terra Lingua, she defines biocultural diversity as the diversity of life in all of its manifestations, biological, cultural, and linguistic, which are interrelated within a complex socio-ecological adaptive system. And so biocultural diversity is really an oasis of diversity that is contained within indigenous territories. And again, sadly, they're often targeted for mining and other extraction. And let's remember that indigenous peoples have their own sciences. And in response to the election of the current president in 2017, when the March for Science happened, a group of indigenous scientists, which I often call myself, banded together and wrote an indigenous science statement that was signed by about 3,000 people. And I will quote briefly from that. "Let us remember that long before Western science came to these shores, there were indigenous scientists here. Native astronomers, agronomists, geneticists, ecologists, engineers, botanists, zoologists, watershed hydrologists, pharmacologists, physicians, and much more, all engaged in the creation and application of knowledge, which promoted the flourishing of both human societies and the beings with which we share the planet." Today, this knowledge is often called traditional ecological knowledge because many native traditions have stories and memories going back intergenerationally, what we would call long-term research, going back not just decades, but sometimes hundreds of years. In fact, there are some stories in some tribes that talk about the last ice age. One of my tribal elders on Anishinaabe has a head of a saber-toothed tiger, and they have stories about that. Something that Vine Deloria Jr. calls geomythology. So the mythology of stories going back in geological time. So native lands are very important, and yet indigenous peoples represent the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to the first impacts of climate change. As we know, climate change has various manifestations, but it really shows up in the way it alters two critical life elements, water and fire. Two elements that indigenous peoples have studied painstakingly through centuries and millennia, how to manage water in the deserts, how to do dry farming like the Hopi do with less than 5 inches of rain sometime and grow good food for your communities. Or in the other extreme, the wettest place on the planet in Kauai, in the Pacific Islands in Hawaii, where there's so much water, and yet the Hawaiians call wealth vai-vai. Water is vai, wealth is vai-vai. So fresh water is something that native peoples have studied over and over. And as we see, climate change is making extreme drought in places like the West with these extraordinary fires we're experiencing, but it also causes outrageous flooding and erosion. Many of the tribes in Washington state, up in British Columbia on the coastal tribes, their villages are literally eroding into the Pacific Ocean. We also see saltwater inundation with the island nations in the Pacific that's intruding into their rich agricultural fields, causing food insecurity. So the way climate change is impacting water is directly impacting indigenous people's food security. It's also influencing, obviously, fire. And again, indigenous peoples have profound spiritual, cultural, pragmatic relationships with fire, and all cultures, you know, our Greek mythology and Roman talk about stealing fire, and you know, fire is fuel and fire is light, and fire cooks our food and keeps you warm in winter nights. So we really love fire, and yet we're out of balance, right? Extreme out of balance with fire. And indigenous peoples, again, have knowledge and sciences of how to manage fire. And even though climate change is one of the greatest drivers of this, these fires, certainly if indigenous people had been practicing their prescribed cultural burning like they historically did, I think we wouldn't be seeing as much of these devastating fires that we've been experiencing in the West. So Native peoples are the canaries in the coal mine, and are trying to speak out in many different ways about how to take action, from youth movements to NGOs to political lobbyists. It's extremely important to identify some of these tools that Native folks are working with in coalition with environmentalists, conservationists, climate scientists. And one particular case I want to mention where these coalitions are having an impact or are trying to have an impact is on a very dynamic site called the Bears Ears National Monument in southern Utah. Bears Ears has the potential to be another Standing Rock, where thousands and hundreds of thousands of indigenous people and allies came together to protect the sacred Missouri River for the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation, and that sacred watershed from the Dakota Access Pipeline from oil extraction and poisoning. Well, Bears Ears has that potential as well. Under the Obama administration, this almost 2 million acre land area in southern Utah was finally put into protection by the efforts of mainly 5 tribes, a coalition of the Hopi Nation, the Navajo Nation, 2 of the Ute Nations, and the Zuni Nation in the Four Corners area of the American Southwest. And there was some great hope to finally represent co-management, the best of Western science and the best of traditional ecological knowledge, to manage this area. It contains rare endemic plant and animal species, over 100,000 archaeological sites that contain rock art, burials, landmarks, so many cultural resources that this coalition is trying to use the Antiquities Act to permanently protect the site. But with the current administration, as Professor Fieldman just showed so well, the rollbacks and the setbacks of these environmental protections has just been devastating for tribes in the United States. And there's been what many call illegal actions on the part of the administration to go in and do mining and other extractive activities within one of our national monuments. And so indigenous peoples are obviously deeply attached to our lands and places, and Bears Ears National Monument is an incredible site and kind of a galvanizing site to bring together tribal nations, indigenous leaders, environmentalists, land trusts, to protect the site for the future, not just for the tribes, but for all people. We're at a crossroads in the history of humanity. We are at a crossroads in the history of this planet. Mother Earth is going to be okay. She's going to survive, but you know, a lot of her species, including the human species, we may or may not survive. So this election and this time has been prophesized in many of our native stories that we're at this crossroads. Our Anishinaabe 7th Fire prophecy says we can either go the scorched earth path or the green path. And really that video talking about decarbonizing pretty clearly shows to decarbonize is to get off the scorched earth path and to get on the green path. And it's something we all need to engage in. So thank you for your attention and thank you for listening. And I look forward to our further conversation with you all. Chi-miigwech.
Thank you very much, Professor Nelson, in informing everyone who heard you about the significance of Bears Ears and the significance of indigenous people in the United States vis-a-vis the environment. Our next speaker is Professor Kathleen Mcafee of the Department of International Relations. And Professor McAfee's research is about, quote, selling nature to save it, climate cap and trade, carbon offsets, and alternative approaches linking climate change, public health, food, and global environmental justice. Professor McAfee was a co-founder of the City Life Vida Urbana in Boston and has ties with social justice movements in different world regions. Professor McAfee, who received her PhD at UC Berkeley, joined the faculty of the Yale School of Forestry after a career in international development. In California, she works with local organizations for the phase out of fossil fuels and teaches political economy and environmental policy at San Francisco State. Professor McAfee. You need to unmute yourself, Kathy.
Okay, hi.
You got it.
Yeah, back in action. Okay, let me get some screen sharing going here. I'm going to show you some slides, I think. What am I showing you here? Yes. Okay. Okay, that's me, you can see. So people have made so many good points and we're running short on time. So I'm gonna zip through these slides as fast as I can. And we'll see how far I get. So first thing, I think the point has already been made by several people that the Trump administration, Donald Trump in particular, is at war with science. I don't think I have to persuade you of this, but this one example, the government report that a couple years ago that came out talking about the seriousness of climate change. Well, this was the president's response. Just don't believe it. And I saw just yesterday when he was here in California talking with Governor Newsom, he said the same thing. He doesn't think that the scientists really know what's causing climate change and fires. So that has not changed. I think you probably know that he has been bragging about getting rid of our participation in many international treaties, but the one that concerns us here is the Paris Climate Agreement, signed in 2015. Trump, this is from 2 years ago, but he's still tweeting the same thing. Time to end the ridiculous and extremely expensive Paris Agreement, return money back to the people in form of lower taxes. And he has the gall to say that the United States was ahead of the curve in climate policy. So you can judge for yourself about this. Just a reminder. You already know this, though. What about the Republican Party platform? Yeah, who needs it? Republican Party this year decided they wouldn't even bother to have a party platform. They said they're going to just use the same one as 2016. They're going to make America great again, as Pence said during their convention. However, they did come up with this list of what they're calling core priorities, 50 points, priorities for a second term. So I said, let me look at this and see what their environmental position is. Well, guess what? Environment isn't even mentioned, except I tried to find something environmental in their list of 50 points, and these were the only two that sort of seemed like related to the environment. We're continuing to lead the world in the cleanest drinking water and cleanest air. We're going to clean up our oceans. So that was it. I looked at the Biden Trump main website, and where I found some reference to climate. It was in terms of a critique, more than a critique, of the so-called extreme climate agenda of the Biden campaign. Trump talks about, or this website talks about millions of good-paying blue-collar jobs that are going to be destroyed by any environmental activity. Well, there are so many ways that we could refute that, but here's just one of them. There are more jobs in clean and efficient energy, and the number of jobs in fossil fuels are already less and shrinking fast. So that's where they stand. But what about the other guy? What's he got to offer us besides ice cream and money? Well, when he hears the words climate change, says Joe Biden, I hear the words jobs, good paying union jobs that will solve our jobs crisis while addressing our climate crisis. Sounds good. But what about the specifics? Well, Professor Fieldman has already started to tell us something about this that I want to repeat and emphasize a little more. How did Biden even come to take this position? Well, not on his own. He was pressured by social movement activism. And, you know, as I say many times over in teaching about the history of political economy, social movement activism is one of the most important ways that changes come about. It's almost the main way that change comes about. So here, quoting directly from this article, which I grabbed from the Washington Post, it says that Biden's original climate proposal did not impress young activists. The youth-led Sunrise movement gave Biden an F, saying his plan lacked detail and paled in comparison to the more aggressive action proposed. So that is a lesson that we must not forget. These people are going to make.
Kathy,
say yes?
I just wanted to mention, can you repeat that? Because the audio broke up.
Oh, okay. The youth-led Sunrise movement gave Biden an F, saying his plan lacked detail and paled in comparison to the action proposed by Sanders and Warren and the Green New Deal. Did that cover it, Joel?
Yeah.
Okay. And as Professor Fieldman just told us, this activity dates back already a couple of years when the Sunrise activists, joined by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, participated in a climate change sit-in at the office of Nancy Pelosi. And that activity led to the development of a Senate Committee on Climate Change. I had to take out some of these slides because I knew I would have too many, but you can look at these, the statements of these Senate Democrats online anytime, and I can provide you with the links. The Sunrise Movement, here we see Varshini Prakash, who's the executive director of Sunrise. Here we see a clip from the main website of Sunrise. Here we see some Sunrise people, along with indigenous activists. This particular mobilization at the California Air Resources Board, which is the main climate regulatory body in California, pushing for ending fossil fuels, phasing out fossil fuels much more seriously than California has begun to do. And I have a lot more to say about California climate policy. It's one of the things that I do research on and public speaking about, as well as activism. So let me know if you want to know more about that. But here we are to talk about the election. So let's look at the Democratic Party platform compared to the non-existent Republican platform. So what do the Dems say they're gonna do? Well, strong statement. And this statement has been repeated by Biden since, not before the youth activism pushed him to change, but since then he adopted this position, and that's a pretty good position. But the phrase net zero is a problematic one that I hope I'll have a little bit of time to say something about. So among the many things, the Bears Ears Monument that Professor Nelson was just talking about, that protecting that, the Arctic Wildlife Refuge from oil drilling expansion, protecting public lands, growing carbon sinks, which basically means plant a lot of trees, and I'll come back to that if I have time. Growing a clean energy economy with unionized jobs and diverse workers. The Dems have come out in favor of a whole list of energy sources, and I want you to notice here that basically this is the same policy as existed under the Obama administration. Basically, they're saying all of the above. They're including the development of new nuclear, that's this advanced nuclear, that's what that refers to. And they're also talking about carbon capture and storage, which is a very problematic concept, as I'll say in a minute. Energy efficiency investments in housing and transportation, that's all good. They're saying that it's okay for California to set its own auto fuel efficiency standard, something that Professor Fieldman mentioned. The Trump administration has been suing California to deny us the right to do that. Again, net zero appears in their discussion of agriculture. And agriculture especially industrial agriculture with heavy use of fossil fuels in the form of machinery and agrochemicals, especially fertilizer, generates a lot of carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, which are damaging not only the atmosphere, but our waterways and even the oceans, producing dead zones in the oceans. So it's important that at least they recognize that there's a problem. Whether net zero is the answer is another issue. They're calling for the reduced use of pesticides and fertilizers, which is definitely going in the right direction. They're calling for an environmental justice fund and paying attention to frontline communities. And these are the communities that have already been mentioned by professors who just spoke before me, the communities that here in California, just like in Louisiana, just like in many other parts of the world, if you are a person of color, there's a much greater likelihood that you are living near, let's say, a fossil fuel refinery, like the Chevron refinery that I can see right out my window right now. It's much more likely that you are breathing the toxic chemicals that are released alongside greenhouse gases, the chemicals that are shortening our life expectancy and our quality of, diminishing our quality of life in these communities. So that's good. The Democrats are much further along on those kinds of issues. They mentioned disaster preparedness, unlike the Republicans. They say we'll rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement is not nearly strong enough, but at least they're not dropping out of every treaty in the world. They're talking about having a carbon adjustment fee, which is basically a tax on imports from countries that don't abide by their promises under the Paris Agreement. So these things are, well, they're better than the Trump position. That's about all I want to say. But there are a lot of important things that, let's say they forgot. And the first one, there's no recognition of the need to phase out fossil fuels. And to me, that is just astonishing. Not really, but when you think of who gives the donations to the senators who then vote in their favor. But let me just give it some emphasis here. If you don't recognize that we've got to get rid of fossil fuels, then yeah, it's a non-starter. There's no mention in these platforms of the problem of fossil fuel subsidies, because we're not only tolerating fossil fuels, we as taxpayers through our government are subsidizing fossil fuel extraction in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And there was some mention of this in the original party platform, but it was removed right during the convention, much to the dismay of environmentalists and the youth activists that were pushing for it. There's no ban on fracking. Just what we need is, more fossil fuel extraction. Yeah. Well, Joe Biden has been kind of flip-flopping on this one, where in Pennsylvania lately, he's been stressing, I'm not going to ban fracking. There are a lot of landowners in Pennsylvania who are collecting checks for letting fracking happen on their land. So he's desperate for a win in Pennsylvania. So he's backtracking on that right now. There's also in Biden's talk and in the Democrats very often a lot of criticism of other countries, particularly China, which I find to be pretty hypocritical when you consider how little the US has been doing, not only under Trump, but under Obama and Clinton, and go back as far as you want, to slow climate change. The Paris Climate Agreement is voluntary, and part of the reason it's voluntary is that the Obama administration really pushed for it to be just voluntary. In other words, no timelines, no very specific targets about decarbonization country by country. And its goals are way too weak. So that even if every country met its Paris promises, and remember, it's just voluntary, we probably wouldn't be able to keep global warming below 2 degrees and probably not even below 3 degrees. So Paris really is just a baby step. But now finally, the last thing I want to talk about, and this is my last slide. I have a few more, but no time. Net zero carbon is not zero carbon. I hope that everybody who's listening today will take notice of this, because more and more we're seeing every company, business, university, country, taco truck around the world saying, we're going to become carbon neutral. We're going to go to net zero carbon, but this is not the same as zero carbon. Carbon neutrality is not decarbonization. Basically, carbon neutrality or net zero usually means that, let's just say Chevron down the street here, or any industrial facility, can keep on producing greenhouse gases and flaring their methane as long as they are paying somebody in some other place to do something to prevent greenhouse gas emissions or to absorb greenhouse gas emissions, which typically is planting trees. So this is where we run into the problem of this so-called carbon capture and storage. This is explicitly called for in the Democratic platform. But CCS is basically science fiction. It is a non-existent technology at scale. Yeah, you can have small machines that absorb greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide mainly. But to scale it up, it would be not only greenhouse gas producing in itself, but would not be able to make a serious dent in the climate, the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But it's talked about as if this were an alternative to ending fossil fuels. Another version of this is what is increasingly popular, called natural climate solutions. And the basic idea is that we'll plant a lot of trees, or we'll switch to biofuels. And that's switching to biofuels is what some of the Bay Area big refineries, remember we're in an oil state with 5 big refineries right here in the Bay Area. 2 of them are talking about switching to so-called biofuels, which really compete with the production of food around the world. So there are many problems with biofuels. But the one that I've been doing the most research about is this idea that if we plant 1 trillion trees, as the wealthy elite at the Davos convention in Switzerland promised to do this January, and as Trump endorsed, we're going to plant 1 trillion trees. But what that's doing, first of all, planting trees does not absorb an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide, and it's only temporary, where once you release this carbon dioxide, it's there for at least 100 years. And another aspect of this is what some people are calling carbon colonialism. It's basically what you're doing here, and this is actually on the planning list for California as well as many other countries. You're shifting the climate burden onto poorer people, weaker people, distant places, especially the global south, the ex-colonies, the would-be developing countries of the world. This is what I do my research on. So I have a lot more to say about it. I mean, just here's an example of an article for an economics magazine that I wrote recently. And here's a reminder of who is really impacted by climate change. The dark red up here is who produces the greenhouse gases. The red down here is who gets screwed by the worst by climate change. But I think we should add California into this list. But, you know, again, just to finish, the climate solutions are basically ending fossil fuels. And we have plenty of people. This is a delegation from California that went to an international conference where Jerry Brown was bragging about California's lead in climate policy to bring a much more realistic assessment of what needs to be done. So there's plenty of opportunities for y'all to get involved in this and join these activities. as researchers, as activists, but especially right now as voters, because that's what we've got to work on right now, is getting up that vote and voting as if our lives depended on it, because they do.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I really appreciated your clarification of net zero. I don't think that is abundantly understood by the public. And I think it is an example of the kind of manipulation that we should all criticize. So I really like the fact that you highlighted that along with your other excellent slides. Well, let's turn to our fourth speaker, Professor Logan Hennessey. And Professor Hennessey is Associate Professor of Environmental Social Science in the School of Humanities and Liberal Studies. Professor Hennessey holds a PhD and an MS degree in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley. His research interests are in indigenous environmental politics, climate policy, and the political economy of the mining and oil industries. Working closely with local communities and organizations, as well as the Bay Area nonprofit groups, Professor Hennessey has published critiques of, quote, sustainable mining, which is another phrase that one could think is manipulative, and geographies of interventions in indigenous territories in Ecuador and Guyana. This work has led to the participation and presentations at United Nations meetings on climate change, where he is following the role of indigenous peoples in these debates. Professor Hennessey teaches his courses to demonstrate the complexity of global resource debates through personal fieldwork experiences. This is especially true for Future of the Forest, one of his courses. On 3 occasions, he has taught Liberal Studies 430 as a 3-week intensive study abroad field course in Ecuador, bringing students from SFSU into some of the most biodiverse and contested ecosystems in the world. Students visit cloud forests and lowland rainforests to study forest ecology and meet with communities and organizations struggling for conservation in a storm of deforestation pressures. Thank you very much for all your work, Dr. Hennessey, and now we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thanks to all of the other distinguished panelists. This has been so great to think about for a while and now see it come to fruition. And I think your students are really getting a nice comprehensive picture of a lot of important issues right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about, and let me just confirm, can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Fine.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as, let's call it the geopolitical arena under which this election is happening right now. And we're going to look at a little bit of some of the things that Trump has done that might not necessarily be directly on the radar, and think about those consequences for communities and forests and ecosystems abroad. So we're going to have a kind of global lens right now. I'll start with the Paris Agreement, but I'm not going to go into depth on this since it was previously discussed briefly. But a couple of important things, just to reiterate them. The targets that were set in this agreement are not necessarily sufficient for what we actually need to accomplish. We really need to get down to at least 1.5 degrees below previous levels. And there have been pledges from the rich nations to help out the poor nations to adapt and mitigate and try and adjust to this onslaught of global climate change experiences that they're about to have, or that they already are experiencing. That $100 billion annually was pledged. However, only a very small fraction of that amount is actually going to the global south right now. And as mentioned before, a lot of the framework is built on individual country responsibilities. They have these nationally determined contributions, but the contributions from the United States are just pledges, and we haven't actually really committed to anything significant yet. So just be thinking about that as I go through what I'm about to talk about. So one of the important things to consider when we are looking at the global picture, and perhaps the responsibility of the United States, which is linked to our current political leaders, is this issue of climate justice, right? A lot of countries out there that, however you want to call them, the global south, lesser developed countries is the kind of terminology that the United Nations use, are very small contributors to the overall climate emissions, less than 1% for many of these countries of global emissions. And so they articulate the problem as one of the problem of a climate debt that has been put on them by the global north, right? Our years and years and decades of emissions from countries like the United States and a lot of European industrialized nations, they're the ones that are responsible for the current climate changes that we're experiencing worldwide, because these poorer countries have not actually contributed that much. So there's an issue there about an injustice for existing impacts. So they take that long-range view of this. At the same time, a lot of these communities and countries are really at the forefront of impacts from continued resource exploitation. And I'm going to talk about that right now. But what I mean is anything that, you consume products on a daily basis in your store. Have you ever thought about the carbon footprint of that product and the raw materials that go into producing the things that you buy on a daily basis? Those kind of carbon footprints actually have consequences for communities and ecosystems worldwide. So there's a lot of these communities are experiencing these continued impacts. And then Kathy had talked about a little bit the issue about the colonization, which is another component of the climate justice framework, right? These solutions, these ideas of carbon offsets or even balancing carbon, the kind of net zero idea for communities in some places is considered, they consider that almost a false solution, something that doesn't really have teeth in it. At the same time, for many, and Melissa mentioned, 350 million indigenous communities and many other forest communities around the world currently control 300 billion metric tons of carbon in these communities. But a lot of them do not have secure land tenure. And so this is part of the big problem. So let's talk about that as we think about our current president and take a look at his administration over the past few years. Some of the things which we're going to call Trump's geopolitics, and he had a nice little catchphrase for it that we're going to unpack a little bit. Well, first of all, not surprisingly, and you probably already are aware, one of Trump's favorite things to do is to act unilaterally, to take the United States off on its own direction, to somehow compromise our alliances with existing allies that we've had for a long time. And he does that pretty significantly right now. He's doing that in the oil and gas sector. We saw that, domestically, he's expanded things, but he's also really pushed for a global dominance of United States oil and natural gas companies worldwide. There are many ways in which he's accomplishing this, and which the State Department and the Energy Department are doing this. One of them, for example, has been an aggressive campaign of sanctions against Iran and Venezuela, which are two key countries involved in OPEC. And normally that would drive oil prices up, but instead Trump has used those sanctions to create a new market for American oil and natural gas and weaken OPEC. And so, right, you might not realize it, but in 2019, the United States became the world's #1 oil producer worldwide. And we are now positioned to become the 3rd largest producer of natural gas. Over the next 10 years, this is projected to control 61% of global production in oil and natural gas worldwide. So that's part of this agenda, right? This agenda of pushing into global markets worldwide. Along with that, we also see some other interesting things which are more consistent with, I think, his social agenda, which is to pull back from anything that would perhaps put that kind of economic profile at risk, namely pull back from the Declaration on the Rights on Human Rights at the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Convention, to pull back from something called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EITI, and to use his domestic leverage in political courts inside the United States to weaken existing US laws which are passed by Congress, which are designed to hold United States companies accountable. So there's a bit of secrecy happening here. He's trying to make sure that companies can operate without any hangups around the world. One of these, for example, is the disclosure of payments that should be made from United States companies to foreign governments and to our own government. And surprise, surprise, the biggest companies that objected to that policy inside the United States were Chevron and ExxonMobil. The speculation is that not only are these companies perhaps not paying very much taxes to the United States government, but actually, as has been mentioned, are receiving huge amounts of subsidies and perhaps are actually in a position of negative taxes. In other words, they're making profit from the United States government rather than paying taxes for the operations that they do worldwide. Along with that, there is evidence about expanding military support for extractive industries, particularly in Africa, where there are proposals and already construction underway for massive new pipeline developments. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but that's part of this overall framework. And I think the most interesting one is, of course, the phrase molecules of freedom and freedom gas. When Trump talked about expanding liquid natural gas markets in Europe, it was sold as a way for Europeans to maintain a little bit more autonomy over their gas market against what was then kind of a monopoly with Russia. So this is the way in which this political agenda is in tandem with this economic agenda of global dominance, right? Let's expand American oil markets and natural gas markets all over the world, and we'll spread freedom at the same time. So here's some examples of how that works, actual data. There's an arm of the United States which used to be called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. It's no longer called that, it's now called the International Development Finance Corporation. And this is an arm which provides backing money for extractives working overseas. In other words, insurance, sometimes preliminary investment guarantees that allow companies to work around the world. So during Trump's administration, and this is also true during Obama's as well, you could see some examples of that too, but during Trump's administration, these are the existing pledges of funding for the expansion of fossil fuel investments worldwide. $1.7 billion for liquid natural gas facilities, a power plant and pipelines in Mozambique. 350 million for various liquid natural gas facilities in El Salvador, Israel, also the Middle East, not to mention several other investments, pipelines, petrochemicals is a big thing. I'll talk about that in a second. power plants and mining all over the place. You can see that list of countries there on my slide: Senegal, Argentina, Brazil, Honduras, you name it. So this is a whole series of investments that are coming from the Trump administration to expand that agenda of now, what's interesting is actually the pandemic has thrown a bit of a wrench into this whole situation, because since the pandemic, a lot of oil companies and natural gas companies have actually lost tremendous profits and put their investments in risk. In fact, so while this is happening, there are estimates that perhaps as much as $1 trillion in infrastructure assets around oil and natural gas are at risk of abandonment as the global gas risks become oversupplied and as the markets have tanked because people are not driving, they're not consuming as much around the world. The markets for other petrochemical products like plastics have also plummeted. And that's encouraged the plastics industry to try to use its diplomacy to create new markets for dumping plastic waste in places like Kenya and open up new plastic abandonment. So a lot of interesting stuff there with the associated consequences of the pandemic. Let me show you an example of one new development, which I have a little bit of experience with, at least in this country. I've done some field work in Guyana looking at mining impacts from gold mining, but oil is the new frontier. And as ExxonMobil are one of our largest oil companies, and remember that Rex Tillerson was the CEO of ExxonMobil, was President Trump's first selection for Secretary of State. He was since dismissed, but still, there's a nice little overlap there between oil companies and international foreign diplomacy. And actually, we see that right now because on Thursday this week, Mike Pompeo is scheduled to be in Guyana, talking probably about this oil project and the geopolitics in relationship to Venezuela next door. So let me just talk a little bit about this new project. It's huge. It's a large offshore oil facility off the coast of Guyana that Exxon has already started producing. They're already pumping something like 250,000 barrels a day from this oil field, and it represents a huge amount of money. It would be transformative for this country. This is a small country of about 800,000 people. And right now, their current budget is, $1.4 billion of an annual budget. But the amount of money that they would be making from this partnership with Exxon would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Some of that is still under dispute because there's a little bit of a political fight right now, but it's a ton of money. And there's potentially 6 billion barrels in this series of reserves offshore here, a huge amount of money. Exxon was the first in. There are some other smaller oil companies in here. And at the same time, Exxon is desperate. They are right now, they've lost since 2014, their overall market share has dropped $267 million. They lost so much since the beginning of the pandemic that the Dow Jones actually took them off of their index. And so while they have divested from other projects around the world, they're actually putting a lot of weight into this particular one. They say that Guyana remains an integral part of their long-term growth plans, and as such, they're high priority. There have been allegations that because of the Trump antagonistic relationship with Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro, that perhaps there would be a movement to start using Guyana as a political platform to pressure Venezuela even further. I saw some headlines that said perhaps they would request permission to use radio transmissions, sending them over the border for America's Voice of America radio broadcast to try to start and put some pressure on Venezuela. So that's one example of how oil works and has been operated under the expansion of Trump's administration. Now, I could talk a little bit more about some of the environmental impacts of this. I just wanted to note the importance of coastal communities that live in these regions, who live in some cases next to important types of forests and other ecosystems which provide huge ecosystem services, namely mangrove forests and other things. A lot of those communities that live in the coastal area are indigenous, and there are also just communities of color in this area who use these resources for a variety of survival mechanisms. So offshore represents a huge risk. In addition to that, I didn't mention the fact that most of Guyana is actually below sea level. So they have a wall that they've built to protect ocean, infiltration into the land. But when you think about rising sea levels and the additional carbon that would be contributed to the atmosphere from this project and those coastal risks, I really think that this project is a huge problem. So when you think about these sorts of examples and that suite of investments that the administration has pursued around the world, they are obviously putting a lot of communities at risk, not just those here in Guyana, but around the world. I saw some figures that perhaps as many as 17 to 25 million people each year are displaced by natural disasters connected to climate change impacts. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, estimates that several hundred million will migrate over the next 30 years, internally as well as externally, as a result of those sorts of impacts. And there are a bunch of other things that we don't have time to discuss, but connected to that: land grabs, violence, existing human rights violations, deforestation, which is happening on massive scales, especially in places like Brazil and Peru. So there are huge amounts of impacts from these sorts of operations as extractives expand, as other kinds of investments move around. As people try to resist this also, there's a huge problem globally, right? As I mentioned, Trump explicitly pulled back from accountability and transparency. Well, think about that when at this election time, right? There is a push to actually put a lot of pressure on activists worldwide trying to defend themselves against this sort of thing, regardless of what ethnicity or racial group they belong to. Activists all around the world are being harassed, beaten up, sometimes murdered. And there's a group called Global Witness that is actually tracking this carefully. They came out with a couple of reports, and they've actually continued that. Every year they produce a new report. So the report for 2019 suggested that maybe as many as 200 people were killed as activists trying to defend their communities and adjust to some of these climate change impacts. And a lot of that actually is connected to extractives. It's connected to mining, it's connected to oil, and other things. So as Melissa mentioned in greater detail than I did, a lot of important things can be learned from indigenous communities. They are the ones that actually have intimate connections to their environment in ways that scientists are actually still trying to catch up to be honest. And we need to pay attention to that very closely. And we need to, secondly, pay attention to where these communities are and the carbon that they are actually protecting and defending currently, which is, I don't have that figure in front of me, but again, 300 billion metric tons of carbon in communities who are indigenous or forest communities around the world. But the issue is their land tenure, their unstable land tenure that they're struggling with. I wish I had actually had 2 more days to prepare, because on Thursday is the perfect connection to this panel and my topic, which is a webinar. So I'll just promote it for folks that want to see it. The regulatory rollbacks, the green recovery about indigenous peoples and their voices, which is sponsored by an organization called the Tenure Facility. This is going to be quite interesting. A mixture of activists as well as indigenous leaders will probably present some interesting information, and I can drop this into, I can email it to Joel or something in a second or after the presentation. So all of those things I think you should think about as a citizen of not only the United States, but as a global citizen, which is part of what San Francisco State takes quite seriously, and what you should be thinking about seriously too as a voter. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Joel, for the invitation, and thank you to my panelists to be part of this.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Logan. I think you're reinforcing some points that Professor Nelson made about the environmental significance of indigenous populations, as well as the role of foreign policy of the United States, which is really globally a very significant actor, probably either first or second with China in impacting the world with regard to the environment. We have a few minutes and some questions, and I want to see, let's see, there is a question, Professor Logan, about how can Biden go against this huge numbers you cited invested in Guyana, and how much damage would it affect the United States or the world?
Sure. That's a great question. I mean, given what Professor McAfee had presented in terms of what the Democratic platform is, it really remains a big question of how much are the Democrats actually going to scale back global fossil fuel production. You know, they can say all they want about green jobs in the United States and in mitigation and things like that, but are they really going to push and promote a scale back of fossil fuel production of American companies worldwide? I kind of doubt it, to be honest. Not to be too pessimistic, but I don't see the Democrats really putting too much pressure on these companies. On the other hand, I could see them maybe, you know, not actively, I should say. I could see them maybe promoting, like I was saying before, some of the more transparent policies, trying to make it a little bit more accountable or transparent, which doesn't necessarily slow it down. It just changes the dynamic a little bit to make it, you know, a little bit trickier. And others might have other insights into this too.
Okay, we have a few minutes, and I would like to ask one question for all members of the panel. As an instructor in the environment, sometimes we just throw out so many problems to students, to the audience, that the sheer number of different problems is overwhelming. Can you pick one problem that you think, as a member of the voting public and student, that you would argue for as the one to focus on to understand the seriousness, the urgency of the general set of problems on the environment? Let me go back to our first speaker. Professor Fieldman, would you pick one that you would focus on for the people viewing this?
Probably climate change, just because of the urgency of it is so acute that, and because carbon dioxide, as we said, lasts a long time in the atmosphere. And so every day that we wait, every day that we stall around, it gets worse. So there's that. But I also want to say something else here. Forgive me, Joel. But
okay.
One problem I talk to my students about a lot, which is really fixable and would help to address not only climate change, but a number of the other problems that the whole panel has discussed, is the problem of money in politics. We have a political system that is marinated in money, and it influences both parties. And it's one of the main reasons we haven't done anything significant. Neither Democrats nor Republicans has done enough about climate change and is unlikely to do enough in the future. And I think it's a solvable problem, right? This is our political system. This political system was made by humans, and we can decide to take it back if we want. And so I think when people get discouraged, and this is discouraging, disheartening, these are terrible things we're talking about. Where do we start to get a handle on it? I think one of the ways that we can get a handle on it is to look at how our at the political dysfunction of our system, and there are things we can do about that.
I think as a political scientist, the role of campaign contributions and the influence, Logan was talking about the influence of corporate money in campaigns, and then when the party wins, the influence. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have not heard either candidate say a word about campaign finance reform. And that is, I think, revealing of your very point about how important it is. Let's go to Melissa. Would you pick a problem that you think people, if they were going to just focus on one problem, Glenn picked climate change, what would you pick?
I would probably pick water quality, water cleanup, watershed restoration, because you can't live without eating, you can't grow food without water, we can't live without water. Water is life, agua de la vida. You know, it's so primal, and yet our fresh water has been so contaminated and polluted from toxic runoff and industrial activities, our cars, and that's something you can do about it. Save the Bay, San Francisco Bay, little urban creek watershed groups. There's so many different ways that any student, anybody can get involved with water cleanup, water restoration, water rights of peoples who have been, you know, suffering from structural oppression, cut off from fresh water. So there's many, many different ways. But I would say that I tell my students when they start getting depressed from the overwhelm, environmental activism starts with the breakfast you eat. Every decision we make as a consumer affects the environment, whether it's recycled or not, whether it's organic or not. And yes, there are class and economic issues, but basically there are so many entry points to doing something positive for the environment with our consumer choices and our carbon footprint and our daily choices and behaviors. But I'd say water is primal. Yeah.
To reinforce your point, international political scientists believe if there is any kind of war based on environmental conflict over resources, it would be over water. And we have already seen political conflicts between nations over water rights. So I think that reinforces your point. Kathy, what would be your environmental problem that you would put the spotlight on?
Well, climate change, that's what we've been talking about. Is that?
Okay. And would it be because of the unique urgency of it?
Yes, unique urgency of it, yes.
Okay, all right.
That's easy.
Great. Logan, you can have the last word. What
Sure.
problem would you focus on?
Well, I would actually answer that slightly differently, in the sense that I realize as a student, sometimes it can be overwhelming to hear all these things and, you know, to probably get confused about what to do or how to do it. And you know what? You can just choose something. It doesn't necessarily have to be one particular issue or the other. I think the important thing that you want to walk away with is just get involved. Go down to your local food bank, talk to some folks who are planting trees in the urban sector. Go work on water and the local streams in your Bay Area or Los Angeles. You know what? Just start getting involved and reach out and talk to people, and that will really bloom and blossom doors for you, perhaps that you never even imagined of. So that would be my answer.
I'm really glad you said that. We have anticipated in the curriculum the last week of this course on December 8th is entitled, Now That You Voted, What Can You Do in Addition? And we are going to have the Institute for Community Engagement talk about opportunities for students and members of the public to do more than vote. And Logan's comments at the end, I think, were perfect. Just do something. And even if it starts at looking at your breakfast, as Professor Nelson said, or supporting a climate change local organization in your neighborhood, or picking another problem that has a local element to it. The important thing is to do something to contribute on the positive side, since there are so many causes and problems on the negative side. So with that, let me express my heartiest thanks to Professors Fieldman, McAfee, Nelson, and Hennessey for a most engaging and important discussion. I hope the members of the class who have seen this appreciate the real detailed information that you would not likely hear in the usual media sources. And I just want to announce next week will be the topic of education and the election from K to 12 and higher education. And I am really especially thankful to President Mahoney, who will appear next week in talking about the election and higher education, which we all care a lot about. So with that, thanks to our panelists, thanks to our viewing audience, and I will see you next week on education. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you.